Music swells over the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, masking the whispered threats exchanged in the corners of the grand ballroom. High society and organized crime mingle under glittering chandeliers, forming a delicate, dangerous ecosystem of power and fear. In the center of it all sits a young man, entirely alone despite the hundreds of guests surrounding him. The elites treat him like a ghost, an uncomfortable glitch in the perfect portrait of a ruthless syndicate. To them, he is a broken liability. But to one woman watching quietly from the sidelines, he is the only genuine soul in a room full of monsters. Opulence has a scent, and tonight it smelled like expensive gardenias mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of underlying dread. The Santoro estate, a sprawling limestone fortress tucked away in the deepest, most secluded acreage of Long Island, was hosting its annual winter gala. To the public, it was a philanthropic endeavor benefiting local hospitals. To the initiated, it was a summit. Clara Hastings stood near a towering column of imported Italian marble, nursing a glass of sparkling water. She wore a simple deep emerald gown that she had bought on clearance, a stark contrast to the custom-tailored Valentino and Dior parading around her. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. Her father, Arthur Hastings, was a mid-level forensic accountant. He cooked the books for the Santoro syndicate, laundering money through a web of shell companies so intricate that it kept the IRS and the FBI chasing ghosts. Arthur's usefulness bought them an invitation, but it did not buy them respect. Clara watched her father sweating through his tuxedo across the room, nervously laughing at a joke made by Vincent the Blade Carenti, a notoriously volatile capo. Clara's gaze drifted away from the sycophants and the dangerous men in tailored suits. Her eyes settled on the far corner of the ballroom, near a massive, multi-tiered indoor fountain. There sat Leo. Leo Santoro was 24, tall, and possessed the sharp, aristocratic jawline of his father, the Don. He had thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck and piercing, stormy gray eyes. Yet, the resemblance to his ruthless father ended entirely at the physical level. Leo was autistic. In a world that valued deception, eye contact, silver-tongued manipulation, and the aggressive projection of dominance, Leo was unapologetically, fundamentally different. He couldn't lie. He found direct eye contact physically painful. The cacophony of overlapping voices, clinking glasses, and the heavy bass of the string quartet's modernized repertoire overwhelmed his sensory processing. To cope, Leo had retreated to the edge of the fountain. The cascading water provided a steady, predictable white noise that drowned out the chaotic frequency of the room. He sat perfectly upright, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers tapping out a complex, rhythmic mathematical sequence against the fabric of his trousers. Clara watched, her heart aching with a quiet, simmering anger. The cruelty of the room was not in overt bullying. No one was stupid enough to openly mock the son of Dominic Santoro. The Don was a man who had famously ordered the execution of 3 rival bosses before his 30th birthday. Instead, the cruelty manifested as complete, suffocating erasure. Guests actively gave Leo a wide berth. Socialites would walk toward the fountain, spot him, and abruptly pivot on their stilettos. Capos and underbosses who would eagerly kiss Dominic's ring completely ignored his flesh and blood. They treated Leo as though his autism was a contagion, or worse, a shameful family secret that they were politely pretending not to see. Dominic Santoro himself was holding court near the grand fireplace, flanked by his bodyguards. The boss was a terrifying figure, radiating a cold, calculated gravity. He loved his son. Clara had heard the whispered rumors of Dominic tearing a man's throat out for simply using a slur against Leo, but Dominic didn't understand him. He protected Leo by isolating him, placing him in corners with heavily armed guards, standing 20 feet away, ensuring physical safety while entirely abandoning his emotional reality. A sharp laugh pulled Clara's attention back to the present. A wealthy socialite named Beatrice, dripping in diamonds purchased with blood money, had backed up too close to the fountain. She bumped into Leo's shoulder, splashing a few drops of her red wine onto the sleeve of his pristine white tuxedo shirt. Leo flinched heavily, his hands flying up to hover near his ears as the sudden physical contact broke his carefully maintained rhythm. Beatrice turned, her eyes flashing with momentary annoyance. When she realized who she had bumped into, her expression morphed into one of tight, uncomfortable pity. "Oh, it's you," she muttered, not apologizing for the stain. She gave him a strained, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, then hurriedly scurried away as if she had just sidestepped a stray dog. Leo looked down at the red stain on his cuff. His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Clara could see the panic setting in. Stains, sudden changes, disruptions in the pristine order of his environment, these were the things that could trigger a debilitating overload. His fingers began to rub the edge of the stained fabric furiously, trying to erase the imperfection, his distress entirely invisible to the hundreds of people laughing and drinking around him. Clara's hands tightened into fists. She looked at her father, who was still trapped in conversation. She looked at the guards, who were watching for assassins, not anxiety. She took a breath, stepped away from the marble column, and began to walk across the ballroom floor. Navigating the ballroom was like walking through a minefield of ego and malice. Clara kept her eyes focused ahead, slipping past the wives of prominent judges and the mistresses of corrupt politicians. Her emerald dress brushed against the heavy silk of the elite, but her mind was entirely fixed on the man by the fountain. As she drew closer, the noise of the crowd began to fade, replaced by the steady, rushing sound of the cascading water. Leo was still rubbing furiously at his cuff, his brow furrowed in deep distress, his breathing shallow and rapid. Clara stopped a few feet away, making sure to enter his peripheral vision slowly so she wouldn't startle him. She didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, allowing her presence to become a known, static variable in his environment. After a long moment, Leo's frantic rubbing slowed. He didn't look up at her face, but his stormy gray eyes flicked down to the hem of her emerald gown, tracking the slight sway of the fabric. "Club soda," Clara said, her voice soft, level, and entirely devoid of the pitying tone that Beatrice had used. "It pulls the tannins right out of the cotton. If you rub it dry, it sets the stain." Leo froze. He processed the information. He looked at the wet red smudge on his sleeve, then back at the green fabric of her dress. "Tannins," he repeated. His voice was a rich, deep baritone, surprising in its resonance, though it carried a slightly flat, mechanical cadence. "Tannic acid, a class of astringent, polyphenolic biomolecules." "Exactly," Clara said, taking a slow step forward and offering him the clean, unused linen napkin from the small table beside her, along with her untouched glass of sparkling water. "If you dab it with the carbonated water, it disrupts the chemical bond." Leo hesitated. He looked at the glass, then at her hand. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he took the napkin and the glass. He dipped the corner of the linen into the water and began to gently dab at the stain. To his visible relief, the harsh red color began to dilute and lift. His breathing slowed. The crisis of the broken pattern was averted. "Thank you," he said softly, still looking at the cuff. "You're welcome," Clara replied. She didn't walk away. She leaned against the edge of the fountain, mirroring his posture slightly, keeping a respectful distance. "The noise in here is terrible, isn't it?" Leo's fingers stopped tapping. He tilted his head slightly, a micro-expression of surprise crossing his features. People never asked him questions about his experience. They either talked at him loudly, as if he were deaf, or talked about him to his guards. "It is inefficient," Leo stated, his eyes tracing the grout lines of the marble floor. "The acoustic design of this room causes a reverberation time of approximately 2.4 seconds. When 85 concurrent conversations occur, the frequencies overlap. It creates an auditory dissonance. It is physically uncomfortable." "It sounds like being trapped inside a beehive," Clara offered. Leo nodded once, sharply. "Yes, a beehive. That is an accurate metaphorical comparison." Clara smiled. She found his precision refreshing. In a room where every word was a calculated lie or a veiled threat, Leo was the only person speaking absolute, unvarnished truth. The string quartet across the room suddenly shifted their tempo. The cellist plucked a deep, resonant note, and they transitioned into a classical waltz, a structured, sweeping piece with a very distinct, predictable rhythm. Clara noticed Leo's hand. His fingers, which had been tense, began to tap against his knee again, but this time it wasn't a frantic, anxious rhythm. It was a precise 1-2-3, 1-2-3. He was tracking the time signature of the waltz. An idea sparked in Clara's mind. It was reckless. It was a violation of the unspoken social hierarchy. Her father would likely have a heart attack, and the dawn might have her thrown out into the freezing snow. But looking at Leo, cast aside and treated like a broken ornament, she felt a surge of defiant courage. "Leo," she said gently. He didn't look up, but his tapping paused, signaling he was listening. "Do you like the structure of this song?" she asked. "It is a waltz in 3 to 4 time," Leo replied. "The tempo is 72 beats per minute. It is mathematical. It is predictable. I find it agreeable." Clara took a small step closer, stepping into the edge of the open floor space near the fountain. "I know dancing is usually terrible because people crowd you and bump into you, but a waltz is just geometry. It's just angles and counting. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Leo's brow furrowed. He looked at her hand, which she was now holding out, palm up, in a clear but non-demanding invitation. "I won't make eye contact with you," Clara promised quietly. "And I'll keep exactly 4 inches of space between our chests. We don't have to talk. We can just count the geometry. Would you like to dance with me?" For 10 agonizing seconds, Leo stared at her outstretched hand. Clara kept her breathing steady, not pushing, giving him the autonomy to simply say no or ignore her entirely. Then, slowly, Leo stood up. He was a full head taller than her. He reached out, his movements stiff but precise, and placed his right hand lightly on her waist, ensuring the exact 4 inches of distance she had promised. He took her left hand in his right. His grip was firm, grounding. 1, 2, 3, Leo whispered. Clara stepped backward on the 1. 1, 2, 3, she echoed. Together, they stepped out of the shadows of the fountain and into the light. To say that the room went quiet would be an understatement. The silence that swept through the Santoro ballroom was absolute, violent, and instantaneous. It was the kind of silence that usually preceded a gunshot. The low hum of Mafia politics and high society gossip evaporated, leaving only the sweeping, mathematical melody of the string quartet. Clara felt the weight of 300 stares slamming into her back like physical blows. She felt the sudden spike of adrenaline, the primal instinct screaming at her that she had just stepped into the territory of an apex predator, but she forced herself to ignore it. If she tensed up, Leo would feel it. If she broke the pattern, he would panic. She kept her gaze focused firmly on the knot of Leo's silver silk tie. "You're doing perfectly," she murmured, her voice steady. "The geometry is consistent," Leo replied, his eyes fixed on a point just above her left shoulder. He was leading, and despite his initial stiffness, he possessed a natural, rhythmic grace. His mind, wired to recognize and replicate complex patterns, processed the waltz flawlessly. They moved across the polished wood of the dance floor, rotating in perfect, sweeping circles. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Through her peripheral vision, Clara saw the waters part. The crowd was physically backing away, clearing a massive circle for them, not out of respect for the dance, but out of sheer, unadulterated shock. No one touched the Don's son. No one acknowledged the Don's son. And certainly, no one from the lower tiers of the syndicate paraded him in front of the assembled heads of the East Coast families. Near the grand fireplace, the conversation abruptly died. Dominic Santoro, the Viper, turned his head. Dominic was 55, built like a heavyweight boxer, with eyes that possessed the chilling, deadened look of a great white shark. He held a glass of scotch halfway to his mouth, frozen in place. The capos surrounding him, Vincent, Silas, Matteo, all turned, their hands instinctively twitching toward the concealed holsters beneath their tailored jackets. Dominic's jaw tightened. The glass in his hand let out a faint creak as his grip threatened to shatter it. He watched the girl in the cheap emerald dress, spinning his deeply autistic, severely isolated son across the floor. He watched his son, who usually recoiled from human touch, holding her hand, moving with a calm, regulated rhythm. Across the room, Clara's father, Arthur, looked as though he was going to vomit. His face had drained of all color, and he was making a slight, aborted movement forward, terrified of what Dominic might do to his daughter. "The acoustic resonance is shifting," Leo noted, his voice pulling Clara back to him. "The overlapping conversations have ceased. The decibel level has dropped by approximately 60%. "They're just watching us," Clara said calmly, maintaining the 4-inch barrier between them. They've never seen anyone dance a waltz with such mathematical precision before. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch occurred at the corner of Leo's mouth. It wasn't a full smile, but it was a localized relaxation of his facial muscles, Precision is superior to improvisation, he stated. I agree completely, Clara said. The string quartet, sweating under the sudden, terrifying scrutiny of a silent room filled with mobsters, rushed the final bars of the piece. The cellist dragged the bow across the strings for the final resonant note. Leo stopped perfectly on the beat. He stepped back, instantly releasing her hand and waist, re-establishing his personal bubble. The geometric sequence is complete, Leo said. Clara offered him a small, respectful bow. Thank you for the dance, Leo. Thank you for the club soda. For the tannic acid disruption, he replied, already turning his gaze back toward the safety of the fountain's white noise. Before Clara could step away, the crowd parted in a swift, brutal motion. The heavy, measured footsteps of leather on marble echoed through the silence. Dominic Santoro was walking onto the dance floor. Two of his personal enforcers, men built like brick walls, trailed a few paces behind him. The air in the room grew ice-cold. Clara stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She had crossed a line. She had pulled the invisible heir into the spotlight, exposing him to the judgment of the wolves. Dominic stopped 3 feet away from her. Up close, the aura of violence surrounding the man was suffocating. He didn't look at Leo. He locked his dead, shark-like eyes entirely on Clara. Who? Dominic asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried past the 3 of them. Are you? Clara swallowed hard, forcing her chin up. She couldn't show fear. These men smelled fear like blood in the water. Clara Hastings, sir. Arthur Hastings' daughter. Dominic's eyes flicked over her, assessing her cheap dress, her lack of jewelry, her steady but terrified posture. He looked at his son, who had retreated slightly behind Clara, safely out of the direct line of sight. Dominic looked back at Clara. The silence stretched, tight as a garrote wire. The entire syndicate waited for the dawn to explode, to drag the insolent girl out by her hair for making a spectacle of his bloodline. Instead, Dominic took a step closer. The scent of expensive cigars and gunpowder washed over her. My son does not like people, Dominic said softly, dangerously. He does not like being touched. He does not dance. He likes geometry, Mr. Santoro, Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly but holding its ground. I didn't ask him to dance. I asked him to count. Dominic stared at her for a long, calculating moment. The tension was unbearable. Then, slowly, the boss of the most powerful crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was so deliberate that Clara held her breath, half expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a heavy, embossed business card and extended it toward her. My office. Tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock, Dominic commanded softly. Do not be late, Miss Hastings. Without waiting for a reply, Dominic turned on his heel and walked back toward his capos, leaving Clara standing on the empty dance floor, holding a piece of cardstock that felt heavier than a loaded gun. The music slowly started again, but the game had irreversibly changed. The morning sun did nothing to warm the bleak, imposing limestone facade of the Santoro estate. Clara sat in the passenger seat of her father's sedan, watching the wrought iron gates swing open. Arthur Hastings' hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were entirely white. He hadn't spoken a word since they turned off the Long Island Expressway. Clara felt a sickening knot twisting in her stomach, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. Panic was a useless variable. She had learned long ago, surviving in the periphery of her father's dangerous career, that showing fear was the equivalent of bleeding in front of a shark. They were escorted by 2 silent, armed men through the sprawling manor to a wing Clara had never seen. Dominic Santoro's private office was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was entirely paneled in dark mahogany, with towering bookshelves and a massive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. Behind the desk sat Dominic, the Viper himself, smoking a Cuban cigar. Standing in the corner, blending into the shadows, was Silas the Ghost Rossi, Dominic's most lethal enforcer. Sit, Dominic commanded. The word was barely above a whisper, yet it echoed in the cavernous room. Arthur practically collapsed into the leather chair opposite the desk. Clara sat beside him, keeping her spine rigid and her eyes locked on a neutral point on Dominic's desk. Arthur, Dominic began, tapping his cigar over a heavy crystal ashtray. You have been cooking my books for 12 years. You are quiet, you are relatively efficient. But you are not as smart as you think you are. Arthur whimpered. Don Santoro, I swear, the IRS audit on the Oakhaven Development Group was unavoidable. Shut up, Dominic said smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He opened a manila folder on his desk and slid a single sheet of paper toward Arthur. You siphoned $4.2 million over the last 3 years into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under the shell name Apex Horizon Holdings. Did you honestly believe my auditors wouldn't find a leak of that magnitude? Clara's heart stopped. She turned to look at her father. Arthur was weeping silently, his face buried in his hands. He had stolen from the Mafia. He was a dead man. Dominic's cold, deadened eyes shifted from the broken man to Clara. Your father's life is forfeit. In my world, a thief is dealt with quickly and permanently. However, Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her with terrifying intensity. Last night, an anomaly occurred. My son, who has violently rejected every behavioral specialist, psychiatrist, and handler I have hired since he was diagnosed at age 4, engaged in a synchronized physical activity in a crowded room. With you. Clara swallowed the lump of pure terror in her throat. He simply responds well to structure, Mr. Santoro. He needed a predictable pattern. Do not mistake my son's condition for stupidity, Miss Hastings. Dominic snapped, a flash of genuine anger breaking his icy facade. Leo's IQ is recorded at 162. He processes information at a rate that would break a normal human being. But the 5 families do not care about IQ. They care about optics. They care about strength. Dominic stood up, walking slowly around the obsidian desk. I am stepping down as the active head of this syndicate in exactly 6 months. If Leo is perceived as an invalid, the other families will slaughter him the moment I am in the ground. He needs to attend syndicate meetings. He needs to sit at the table. He needs to appear in control. He stopped directly in front of Clara. I have a proposition for you, Clara. You will become Leo's permanent companion. You will shadow him. You will translate this structure and predictable pattern into a method that allows him to function in my world. You will keep him grounded when the noise gets too loud. If you can do this, if you can keep my son sitting upright at the head of the table without a meltdown for the next 6 months, Dominic gestured vaguely toward Arthur. I will forgive the $4.2 million, and I will let your father live. Clara looked at her father, who was shaking uncontrollably, his life hanging by a thread thinner than gossamer. She looked back at the ruthless crime boss. I am not a trained therapist, Clara stated, her voice remarkably even. Therapists treat him like a patient. You treated him like a mathematician, Dominic countered. Do we have a deal, Miss Hastings? There was no choice. The illusion of a choice was just another weapon in Dominic's arsenal. Yes, Clara said, we have a deal, but I have 3 conditions. Silas, the enforcer in the corner, shifted his weight, his hand dropping toward his waist. Dominic held up a finger, silencing him. A dark, amused smirk played on the Don's lips. Conditions. Fascinating. Speak. First, my father retires immediately. He leaves New York today and never returns, Clara demanded. Second, no one touches Leo without his explicit, verbal consent. Not even you. Third, I have complete autonomy over his daily schedule. If I say a room is too loud, we leave. If I say a meeting is over, it's over. If you violate these parameters, his routine breaks, and I cannot guarantee his stability. Dominic stared at her. For a terrifying 10 seconds, Clara thought he might just shoot them both. Then, the Viper gave a slow, measured nod. Agreed. You start immediately. The transition from a quiet life to the epicenter of an organized crime empire was jarring, but Clara found her anchor in the absolute rigidity of Leo's routine. Her first week was spent entirely within the secure, silent wing of the Santoro estate where Leo resided. His suite was a sensory haven, heavy soundproof doors, dimmable ambient lighting, and an absence of strong smells. It was here she discovered that Leo's obsession was not just abstract mathematics, it was structural engineering and cryptography. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Leo was sitting at a massive drafting table, perfectly aligning a specialized T-square over blueprints for a new boutique hotel the Santoro family was building in Manhattan, a massive money-laundering front called the Obsidian Spire. Clara sat 4 feet away, reviewing the syndicate's operational structure, trying to memorize the names of the capos and underbosses she was inevitably going to have to protect Leo from. The load-bearing calculations on the fourth-floor mezzanine are fraudulent, Leo stated suddenly. He didn't look up from the blueprint. Clara put down her binder. Fraudulent? Or a mistake? Mistakes are randomized variables. Fraud is a deliberate pattern, Leo replied, his pencil scratching rapidly across a notepad. The architectural firm Harrison & Cross submitted stress tests indicating the steel reinforcements can support 80,000 pounds. Based on the metallurgical density of the specific alloy they ordered, it can only support 45,000. If they host a capacity event on that floor, the structural integrity will fail. A collapse is a 94% probability. Clara frowned, walking over to the edge of the drafting table, making sure not to cast a shadow over his workspace. Why would they lie about the steel? To embezzle the surplus funds allocated for the higher-grade alloy, Leo said, setting his pencil down perfectly parallel to his T-square. It is an inefficient methodology for theft. It leaves a physical, catastrophic evidence trail. Clara realized with a sudden sharp clarity how Dominic Santoro had managed to run such a flawless financial empire. Leo wasn't just isolated, he was the syndicate's ultimate, infallible auditor. He saw the patterns that no one else could. "We need to tell your father," Clara said. "My father is currently engaged in a sit-down with the regional distributors from the Caldwell cartel," Leo replied, his breathing hitching slightly at the thought of the chaotic meeting room. "Interruptions are penalized." "Not when you're saving him from a multi-million-dollar disaster," Clara insisted gently. "Leo, this is exactly what we discussed, translating your data into their language. You found the flaw. You have to be the one to present it." Leo's hands flew to his thighs, tapping out a frantic, complex rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The meeting room has a reverberation time of 1.8 seconds. There are 11 men present. The probability of overlapping audio frequencies is high. "I have a pair of high-fidelity acoustic earplugs," Clara said, pulling a small black case from her pocket. "They filter out background noise, but allow direct close-range vocals to pass through. It changes the reverberation time to 0. Leo stopped tapping. He looked at the small black case. Slowly, he extended his hand. Clara dropped the earplugs into his palm without touching his skin. He placed them in his ears. "The ambient hum of the HVAC system is gone," Leo noted, his voice slightly louder than usual due to the plugs. "It is acceptable." "Okay, let's go," Clara said. They walked together down the long, opulent hallways of the estate. When they reached the heavy oak doors of the main conference room, 2 armed guards crossed their arms, blocking the path. "Don's in a meeting, Leo." One of the guards grunted dismissively. Clara stepped forward, her voice freezing over. "Leo has an urgent structural update regarding the obsidian spire. Open the doors." The guards hesitated, looking at Clara, then at Leo, who was staring fixedly at the brass hinges of the door. The absolute authority in Clara's voice made them reconsider. One guard knocked twice and pushed the heavy doors open. The room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. 11 men, scarred and lethal, turned to glare at the interruption. Dominic Santoro sat at the head of the table, his eyes narrowing as he saw his son. "Leo," Dominic said, his voice a low warning. "This is not the time." Silas the Ghost Rossi, seated to Dominic's right, let out a harsh, derisive bark of laughter. "Someone lose track of the kid? Get him back to his puzzles before he starts rocking in the corner." Clara felt a white-hot spike of fury. But before she could speak, she looked at Leo. He wasn't panicking. With the earplugs in, the chaotic noise of the men's laughter was muted. He was entirely focused on the geometry of the table and the data in his head. Leo walked precisely to the center of the room, stopping exactly 3 feet from Silas. He didn't look at Silas's face. He looked at the knot of the capo's tie. "The architectural firm Harrison & Cross, which operates under your direct supervisory territory, Silas, is embezzling syndicate funds," Leo stated. His baritone voice was devoid of emotion, loud and clear. "They have substituted grade A tensile steel with a substandard alloy on the 4th-floor mezzanine of the obsidian spire." The room went dead silent. Silas's face flushed a dark, violent red. "You little freak, what the hell are you talking about? I oversee those contracts personally." "Then you are either complicit in the theft, or you possess a profound mathematical incompetence," Leo replied smoothly, stating it as an objective fact rather than an insult. "The metallurgical data is explicitly documented in their purchasing ledgers." A capacity event will result in a structural failure and a 94% probability of mass casualties, triggering an unavoidable federal investigation that will expose the syndicate's laundering infrastructure. Leo placed the blueprint and his notepad, filled with flawless, indisputable calculations, directly in front of his father. Dominic looked at the numbers. He was a ruthless man, but he was not a stupid one. He understood the language of money perfectly. He looked up, his shark-like eyes locking onto Silas. The temperature in the room plummeted. Silas stood up rapidly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Don Santoro, you're not going to listen to the R-Times tard, are you? He's making things up." Clara moved. She stepped cleanly between Silas and Leo, breaking the capo's line of sight to the Don's son. "The math is absolute, Silas," Clara said, her voice dripping with ice. "And if you ever use that word in his presence again, I will personally ensure the Don is made aware of the exact percentage of your incompetence across all your territories." Silas sneered, reaching for her. "You little bitch." "Silas," Dominic's voice cracked like a whip, bringing the capo to a dead halt. The Viper stood up. "Sit down, now." Silas slowly lowered his hand, his eyes burning with a murderous hatred, but he obeyed. Dominic looked at Leo, then at Clara. A strange, unrecognizable emotion flickered behind the Don's eyes, a microscopic glimmer of genuine pride. "Leo," Dominic said quietly, "your analysis is noted. Go back to your drafting." "The variable has been addressed," Leo said simply. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room. Clara followed closely behind him, feeling the absolute suffocating weight of Silas Rossi's glare burning into her spine until the heavy oak doors clicked shut. They had won the battle, but Clara knew, with terrifying certainty, that they had just started a war. 3 weeks passed since the incident in the boardroom, and the atmosphere within the Santoro estate had grown as brittle as dry ice. Dominic had initiated a quiet, ruthless audit of Silas Rossi's territories, stripping the capo of his most lucrative construction contracts. Silas smiled through the sanctions, offering his public apologies and kissing the Don's ring, but Clara saw the venom pooling in the man's eyes every time he passed her in the corridors. She knew Silas wasn't going to absorb the humiliation. In the Mafia, humiliation was a terminal illness. It had to be excised, usually with violence. Despite the looming threat, Clara remained laser-focused on her primary objective, expanding Leo's operational radius. If Dominic stepped down in 5 months, Leo needed to be capable of surviving outside the heavily filtered ecosystem of the estate. He needed to exist in the real world. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Clara decided it was time for a field test. "We are going to Manhattan," Clara announced, stepping into Leo's sanctuary. Leo was meticulously constructing a scale model of the Brooklyn Bridge out of balsa wood and structural-grade cyanoacrylate. He paused, the tweezers in his hand hovering over a microscopic suspension cable. Manhattan is a high-density sensory environment. The ambient decibel level on a standard Tuesday at 10 a.m. fluctuates between 70 and 85 decibels. It is highly inefficient. "I agree," Clara said, leaning against the heavy mahogany doorframe. "But we aren't going to Times Square. We are going to the Stephen A. Schwartzman Building, the central branch of the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue." Leo's eyes darted away from her, tracking the geometric patterns of the Persian rug. He was processing the variables. "The Rose main reading room," Leo murmured, his fingers twitching slightly. 52 feet high. Ceiling murals painted by James Wall Finn. The acoustic design is heavily muffled by millions of linear feet of bound paper. It is a designated quiet zone. "Exactly," Clara said softly. "They have the original 1904 architectural schematics of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company in their special collections. Real, physical blueprints drawn by William Barclay Parsons. I requested them yesterday. We have a private viewing room reserved for 2 hours." Leo carefully set the tweezers down. The prospect of examining original, century-old infrastructure schematics was a powerful counterweight to his anxiety. "The variables are controlled?" "Highly controlled," Clara promised. "We take the armored escalade. We go directly to the underground loading dock. No crowds, no overlapping audio frequencies. Just you, me, and the geometry of 1904 New York." Leo stood up, smoothing down the front of his perfectly pressed charcoal trousers. I will require the high-fidelity acoustic filters. Already in my pocket, Clara smiled. The journey into the city was tense, but not because of Leo. Clara rode in the back of the SUV with him, while two of Dominic's most trusted enforcers, a stoic man named Russo and a driver named Carmine, occupied the front. Clara's tension stemmed from the fact that the escort felt suspiciously light. Dominic usually insisted on a trailing vehicle for his son, but Carmine had casually mentioned that Silas had requested a reallocation of manpower that morning for a shipment down at the Red Hook terminal. Clara's instincts screamed at her, but the heavy steel doors of the library's subterranean loading dock, rolling shut behind them, provided a temporary sense of security. They were escorted up a private freight elevator by a nervous archivist, stepping out into the hushed, cavernous halls of the library's restricted wing. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and lemon polish. For Leo, it was a paradise of order. The books were categorized by the Dewey Decimal System, a flawless, mathematical taxonomy of human knowledge. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his breathing deep and steady. The private viewing room was small, lined with acoustic dampening panels. On the large oak table lay a massive, leather-bound portfolio. For the next 90 minutes, Clara watched Leo exist in a state of absolute flow. He didn't just look at the blueprints, he absorbed them. He traced the lines of the Astor Place station without touching the fragile paper, his mind running load-bearing equations and structural stress tests on a transit system built before the invention of modern computers. Parsons miscalculated the lateral earth pressure on the retaining walls at the 14th Street curve, Leo stated quietly, his eyes darting rapidly across the faded blue ink. He assumed a soil density of 110 pounds per cubic foot. The actual geological composition of Manhattan schist in that sector dictates a density closer to 135 pounds. The wall should have fractured by 1922. Why didn't it? Clara asked, genuinely fascinated by the way his mind deconstructed the world. Because the contractor overordered Portland cement and illicitly widened the foundation to hide the surplus, Leo replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Corruption accidentally reinforced the structural integrity. Clara laughed softly. A very New York kind of miracle. Leo looked up, his gaze catching the collar of her blouse for a fraction of a second before darting away. You understand the data. Most people find the data tedious. I find it beautiful, Clara said honestly. It makes sense. People don't make sense, but this does. Leo nodded slowly. Variables in human behavior are too erratic. You are an exception, Clara. Your behavior patterns are remarkably consistent. I find your presence stabilizing. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given, an admission of trust that made Clara's chest tighten with a fierce, protective warmth. Suddenly, the heavy oak door to the viewing room clicked. Clara turned, expecting the archivist. Instead, Russo, their lead guard, stepped into the room. His face was pale, and he had a hand pressed tightly against his earpiece. We need to move. Now, Russo ordered, his voice tight. Carmine just went dark in the garage. The loading dock doors have been manually overridden and jammed shut. We have incoming. Clara's blood ran cold. Silas. He had used the Red Hook shipment as a decoy to strip their detail, and now he was making his move. He didn't want to kill Leo. Killing the Don's son would unite the 5 families against him. Silas wanted to kidnap Leo, using his severe autism and reliance on routine to break him mentally, turning him into a helpless puppet to extort Dominic into surrendering the syndicate. Leo, Clara said, keeping her voice incredibly level to prevent his panic. She pulled the black case from her pocket. Earplugs. In. Right now. Leo saw the shift in the room's energy. His fingers began to twitch, but he took the earplugs and secured them. The primary exit is compromised, Leo stated, his voice ringing loud in his own ears. He looked instantly back down at the table. He wasn't looking at the subway blueprints anymore. He was staring at a secondary map he had memorized 10 minutes ago, the architectural floor plan of the library itself. We can't go down to the garage, Russo said, drawing a heavy Glock 19 from beneath his jacket. We have to go up. Try to reach the main reading room, blend into the civilian crowd, and call for NYPD backup. Incorrect, Leo said sharply. Russo glared at him. Kid, this isn't a geometry test. We are trapped. The Rose main reading room is a dead end if they control the stairwells. The structural layout dictates a bottleneck, Leo insisted, his hands flapping slightly at his sides as his agitation grew. The library was renovated in 2002. They installed a high-capacity pneumatic tube system for document retrieval that runs adjacent to the original 1,911 steam tunnels. The access hatch is located in the Rare Books Preservation Lab, exactly 42 yards down the eastern corridor. Clara looked at Russo. "Do it. Follow his math." Russo hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Stay behind me." They slipped out of the viewing room and into the hushed, dimly lit corridor of the archives. The silence of the eastern corridor was shattered by the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy boots hitting the marble floor at the far end of the hall. 3 men in dark suits holding suppressed submachine guns rounded the corner, Silas's strike team. "Go!" Russo roared, shoving Clara and Leo forward as he raised his weapon and laid down a suppressing fire. The deafening crack, crack, crack of the unsuppressed Glock echoed violently off the stone walls. Even with the acoustic filters in, the sheer concussive force of the gunfire in an enclosed space hit Leo like a physical wall. He stumbled, clapping his hands over his ears, letting out a sharp, breathless cry of absolute terror. His meticulously ordered world shattered into a chaotic kaleidoscope of noise, smoke, and violence. "Leo, 1, 2, 3, keep the pattern," Clara yelled, grabbing the back of his jacket and pulling him forward. She couldn't respect the 4-inch rule right now. If she let go, he would freeze and they would die. Bullets chewed through the ancient oak paneling behind them, spraying splinters of wood and plaster into the air. Clara dragged Leo, whose eyes were squeezed shut, relying entirely on her momentum. 42 yards! Clara shouted to Russo, who was backing up, returning fire methodically. "Where is the lab?" "Right here." Russo slammed his shoulder into a heavy steel door, marked Preservation Lab, authorized personnel only. The lock gave way with a screech of tearing metal. He hauled Clara and Leo inside and kicked the door shut, dragging a heavy industrial scanning machine in front of it. "They have breaching tools that won't hold them for more than 2 minutes, Russo panted, reloading his weapon. Blood was seeping through the sleeve of his jacket where a ricochet had caught him. The lab was a chaotic mess of chemical baths, UV light tables, and stacks of decaying manuscripts. Leo had collapsed onto the floor in the corner, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was rocking back and forth rapidly, a low, mechanical humming sound vibrating in his throat. He was in full sensory overload. The variables had exceeded his processing capacity. "Leo," Clara dropped to her knees in front of him, ignoring the frantic pounding that had just started on the steel door. She didn't touch him. She knew better. She placed her hands flat on the floor, entering his narrow field of vision. "Leo, look at the geometry of the tiles. Count the tiles." He didn't stop rocking. The humming grew louder, a desperate attempt to drown out the sound of the men outside trying to break in. Clara took a deep breath. She had to anchor him. "The steam tunnel, Leo. You said there was an access hatch. Where is the structural weak point in this room?" "Nothing." Russo fired a shot through the door as the handle began to violently jiggle. "Clara, we are out of time." "Leo," Clara said, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding tone that mirrored his father's, but laced with desperate affection. "The math is failing. I need your structure. Where is the hatch?" The word failing pierced through the static in his mind, the rocking slowed by a fraction. Leo's stormy gray eyes snapped open, wide and dilated with panic, but they tracked toward a large, heavy ventilation grate bolted into the floor near the chemical vats. 4 feet by 4 feet, Leo gasped out, his chest heaving, bolted with standard 3/4-inch hex screws. It drops into a maintenance shaft that intersects the 1,911 steam tunnel. The tunnel leads directly to the Bryant Park subway access grate. "Russo!" Clara pointed to the grate. The enforcer scrambled over, using the steel barrel of his gun as a lever to violently pry the old grate upward. The ancient bolts snapped under the sheer force, revealing a dark, narrow shaft with a rusty iron ladder descending into the gloom. "You go first, Clara. Guide him," Russo ordered, turning his gun back toward the door as the hinges began to buckle. Clara slid into the tight space, her feet finding the iron rungs. She looked up at Leo. He was staring at the dark hole, paralyzed by the shift in environment and the loss of all predictable light and sound. "It's just a cylinder, Leo," Clara called up to him, keeping her voice rhythmic. "It's a perfect geometric cylinder. Step down on the 1. Move your hand on the 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. Come to me. He hovered over the edge. A massive crash echoed above as the steel door partially gave way. 1, Leo whispered, swinging his long leg over the edge. His expensive trousers caught on the rusty iron, but he didn't stop. 2. He descended into the dark. Russo followed seconds later, pulling the heavy grate back into place over their heads just as the strike team breached the lab. The sound of muffled shouting above them was instantly drowned out by the hiss and rumble of the subterranean steam pipes. The air in the shaft was suffocatingly hot and smelled of sulfur and century-old rust. They climbed down for what felt like an eternity, stepping off the ladder into a narrow brick tunnel that ran beneath the roots of Bryant Park. Leo was vibrating with residual adrenaline, his hands flapping at his sides as they walked rapidly through the dim tunnel, guided only by the small flashlight attachment on Russo's weapon. The sensory assault of the gunfire had been replaced by the oppressive, claustrophobic heat of the underground. "We need to stop," Leo suddenly ground out, his voice a strained, harsh whisper. "The thermal regulation is inefficient. My core temperature is elevating. The auditory frequencies of the steam are unpredictable." He hit the brick wall and slid down, clamping his hands over his ears again, squeezing his eyes shut. He was dangerously close to a total shutdown. If he went catatonic here, they could never carry his dead weight out of the tunnels. Russo looked back, his face tight with pain from his gunshot wound. "We can't stop, kid. They'll find the grate. They'll follow us." "Russo, give us 30 seconds. Watch our 6, Clara commanded. She knelt beside Leo in the dirt and grime. She took off her jacket, shielding him slightly from the radiant heat of a nearby pipe. She didn't speak. She just sat exactly 4 inches away, took a steady breath, and began to tap her index finger against the brick wall. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The tempo of the waltz. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the hissing steam and her rhythmic tapping. Slowly, Leo's hands lowered from his ears. He opened his eyes. He stared at her finger hitting the brick. He recognized the pattern. He remembered the ballroom, the cold club soda, the absolute safety she had provided in a room full of monsters. He raised a trembling hand and pressed his own finger against the brick, synchronizing his movement with hers. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. "The steam is just a variable," Clara whispered. "It operates on a cycle. It's predictable." Leo took a deep, shuddering breath. A 30-second pressure release cycle. "It is mathematically sound." "Are you ready to finish the equation?" she asked gently. "Yes." Leo stood up, his posture stiffening, the brilliant, calculating heir to the Santoro Empire piecing himself back together through sheer force of will and the anchor of her presence. "The exit grate is 86 yards ahead. We need to ascend." 10 minutes later, they emerged into the freezing, chaotic air of a Manhattan afternoon, pushing up through a maintenance grate in an alleyway just off 42nd Street. Russo immediately flagged down a civilian taxi, violently pulling the driver out and throwing a stack of $100 bills onto the seat before shoving Clara and Leo into the back. As they sped away, weaving dangerously through traffic toward the safety of an Allied safe house in Queens, Clara looked at Leo. His suit was ruined, covered in rust and dirt. He was exhausted, staring blankly out the window. But then, without looking at her, Leo slowly extended his hand across the leather seat. He didn't grab her hand. He simply laid his hand down, palm up, exactly 1 inch away from hers. It was an invitation. Clara gently placed 2 fingers against his palm. He didn't flinch. Silas had intended to break the invisible air today. Instead, he had forged the one thing Leo Santoro had never possessed, an unbreakable tactical alliance built on absolute trust. And when Dominic found out what Silas had done, the streets of New York were going to run red. Rain began to lash against the reinforced glass of the Astoria Safe House, a nondescript brick building tucked behind a Greek bakery in Queens. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of strong black coffee and the metallic tang of Russo's blood. An underground doctor, a man whose license had been revoked by the state medical board years ago, was quietly stitching Russo's arm in the kitchen. Clara sat on a worn leather sofa in the living room. Beside her sat Leo. He had finally allowed her to use a damp cloth to wipe the century-old rust and grime from his face, though he insisted on doing his hands himself, rubbing the skin until it was nearly raw. The acoustic filters were still in his ears, muting the harsh thunderclaps rattling the windows. 20 minutes later, the heavy steel door of the safe house flew open. Dominic Santoro did not walk into the room. He swept into it like a localized hurricane. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed men, their suits drenched, their faces grim. The Don's shark-like eyes scanned the room, bypassing Russo, bypassing Clara, and locking entirely onto his son. For the first time since Clara had met him, the terrifying Viper looked like a father. His chest heaved, and the color had drained from his usually florid face. He took a step toward Leo, his hands trembling slightly, an instinctual urge to grab his son and check him for bullet holes overriding his usual stoicism. "Don't touch him," Clara said sharply, standing up and blocking Dominic's path. The 6 enforcers in the room instantly tensed, their hands dropping to their weapons. No one spoke to the Don like that. Dominic stopped. He stared at Clara, his jaw clenching so hard she could hear his teeth grind. But he looked past her to Leo, who was staring at the geometric pattern of the scuffed hardwood floor, his hands gripped tightly to his knees. Dominic forced himself to take a step back. "Report," Dominic commanded, his voice a hoarse, gravelly whisper. "Silas used the Red Hook shipment as a diversion," Clara stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline crash threatening to pull her under. He jammed the loading dock at the library, sent a 3-man strike team with suppressed weapons. "We escaped through the 1,911 steam tunnels. He wasn't trying to kill Leo, Mr. Santoro. He was trying to take him." Dominic's eyes darkened to the color of a bruised sky. "To use him as leverage, to force me to hand over the commission." He turned to his lieutenant, a scarred man named Pauly. "Mobilize everyone. I want Silas Rossi's head in a box before midnight. Burn his clubs. Burn his construction sites." "Wait," Leo said. The room fell deathly silent. Even the doctor in the kitchen stopped stitching. Leo didn't look up, but his fingers began to tap a rapid, frantic sequence against his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Burning his construction sites is a statistical error," Leo stated, his baritone voice echoing in the quiet room. Silas's primary front, Apex Builders, recently filed an order for 400 pounds of commercial-grade Tovex explosive, ostensibly for the bedrock excavation at the Hudson Yards project. But the geological surveys for that specific grid show the bedrock is soft Manhattan schist. It does not require Tovex. It requires standard pneumatic drilling. Dominic frowned, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "What are you saying, Leo?" "The explosive was reallocated," Leo continued, his breathing accelerating. The variables were aligning in his mind, forming a terrifying picture. "Silas knew if he attacked me, your psychological profile dictates an immediate, violent emotional response. You would return to your center of power to coordinate the retaliation. You would return to the Santoro estate." Clara's stomach plummeted. She looked at Dominic, whose eyes were slowly widening as he followed his son's horrific logic. "Silas's crews have been performing the HVAC maintenance on the estate's east wing for the last 3 weeks, Leo said, his voice dropping into a flat mechanical deadpan. 400 pounds of Tovex placed within the central ventilation shafts would effectively vaporize the primary residence and anyone inside it. "If you go home tonight, Father, the probability of your death is 99.9%. Dominic stood frozen. The Don, a man who had survived a dozen assassination attempts by rival cartels and federal indictments, had just been outmaneuvered by his own capo. If Leo hadn't tracked the fraudulent explosives order, the Santoro family would have been entirely eradicated by morning. Dominic slowly turned to Pauly. "Call the estate. Evacuate the staff immediately. Tell them to sweep the HVAC system. Do not let anyone start their cars." He turned back to Leo. The cold, deadened look in the Don's eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, awestruck realization. He wasn't looking at a broken liability anymore. He was looking at the most brilliant, dangerous weapon the Santoro family had ever produced. "Where is Silas right now, Leo?" Dominic asked softly. "He will be at the Oakhaven warehouse by the FDR Drive," Leo answered instantly. "It is the only structure he owns with a subterranean egress point that avoids the primary traffic cameras on the Queensboro Bridge. He is waiting for the detonation." Dominic nodded once. He reached inside his coat and pulled out his heavy, gold-plated 1911 pistol, checking the chamber with a sharp, metallic click. "Stay with Clara," Dominic told his son. "When the sun comes up, the rats will be dead." As the Don turned to leave, Leo spoke again. "Father." Dominic paused, looking back. Leo finally raised his head. He didn't look his father in the eyes, he looked at the knot of his father's dark tie, but the posture was rigid, commanding. The structural integrity of this syndicate requires absolute precision. Do not leave any loose variables. Eradicate Silas Rossi entirely. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Dominic's face. "Count on it, my son." 6 months later, the private dining room of the Plaza Hotel's Oak Room was sealed to the public. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, and the air hummed with the quiet, lethal tension of the 5 families. The heads of the New York syndicates, the Falcone, Moretti, Russo, and Costa families, sat around a massive circular mahogany table. They were waiting for the Viper. Rumors had been swirling for months. Ever since the night Silas Rossi and his entire crew disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only perfectly balanced ledgers and a vacuum of power, Dominic Santoro had been retreating from the public eye. The heavy oak doors opened. But Dominic didn't walk in. Leo Santoro stepped into the room. He wore a flawlessly tailored midnight blue suit. His posture was perfectly straight, his movements measured, precise, and devoid of any wasted energy. Walking exactly 1 step behind him and slightly to his left was Clara. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray blazer and trousers, her hair pulled back into a severe, professional knot. She carried a thick leather portfolio. She was no longer just a companion. The underworld whispered that she was his shadow, his translator, the only person who could decipher the terrifyingly accurate machinery of the new boss's mind. The Dons around the table exchanged confused, insulted glances. "What is this?" Don Falcone, a massive, gray-haired brute of a man, grunted. "Where is your father, kid? We don't do sit-downs with the help." Leo walked to the single empty chair at the head of the table. He didn't sit immediately. He stood behind it, placing his hands flat on the mahogany surface. He did not wear acoustic filters today. Over the last 6 months, Clara had worked relentlessly with him, introducing him to overlapping audio frequencies in controlled, mathematically timed bursts, until he could tolerate the friction of a boardroom. "My father officially retired to our properties in Sicily at 0600 hours this morning," Leo stated, his baritone voice ringing out with absolute chilling clarity. "I am the head of the Santoro Syndicate. You will address your grievances to me." A beat of stunned silence was followed by a harsh, barking laugh from Don Moretti. "You? The autistic kid who plays with blocks? Dominic must be losing his mind. I'm not taking orders from a—" "Moretti," Leo interrupted, his voice not raising in volume, but slicing through the room with the precision of a scalpel. He finally lifted his gaze. He didn't look away. He locked his stormy gray eyes directly onto Moretti's, weaponizing his own discomfort, turning his piercing, unblinking stare into a tool of dominance. Moretti's laughter died in his throat. The kid's eyes were like black ice. "Your union fronts on the Brooklyn docks are operating at a 22% deficit," Leo recited, never breaking eye contact. "You have been bleeding capital for 18 months. To compensate, you borrowed $14 million from the Costa family, using your waste management contracts as collateral. Contracts you do not legally own because the municipal permits expired 3 weeks ago." Moretti went completely pale. The other Dons slowly turned to look at him. Leo shifted his unblinking gaze to Don Costa. "If the federal prosecutors audit Moretti's expired permits, your $14 million is seized. Your entire legitimate front collapses. The probability of a RICO indictment for your inner circle is 88%. Leo sat down smoothly, buttoning his jacket. He gestured to Clara. She opened the leather portfolio and slid 4 perfectly organized dossiers across the table, 1 to each boss. "I have recalculated the operational borders of the 5 families," Leo announced. The previous geographic divisions were based on emotional territorial disputes and historical violence. It was highly inefficient. The new borders are based on logistical flow, supply chain optimization, and risk mitigation. If you follow this structure, your profits will increase by a median of 31% within the fiscal year. If you deviate from this structure— Leo paused, his fingers lightly tapping the table. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I will systematically dismantle your financial infrastructure before you can fire a single bullet, Leo finished. The math is absolute. The choice is yours. The room was completely silent. These were men who understood fear, intimidation, and blood. But they had never faced a predator like this. Leo wasn't emotional. He couldn't be bribed, he couldn't be seduced, and he couldn't be intimidated. He was a human algorithm, and he had already checkmated them before they even sat down. Slowly, Don Falcone reached out and pulled the dossier toward him. He opened it, looking at the flawless calculations. He closed it, looked at Leo, and offered a slow, begrudging nod of respect. To the new architecture, Falcone murmured. One by one, the other Dons nodded. The transition was complete. After the meeting, Leo and Clara walked out of the Plaza Hotel and into the cool evening air of Manhattan. The armored Escalade was waiting at the curb. Leo stopped on the sidewalk. The ambient noise of the city, the sirens, the honking cabs, the chatter of thousands of people washed over them. It was a chaotic, unpredictable mess of variables. But Leo didn't flinch. He reached out and lightly touched the sleeve of Clara's jacket. "The geometric sequence holds," Leo said quietly. Clara smiled, a genuine warm expression that stood in stark contrast to the cold world they now ruled. "It always will, Leo. 1, 2, 3. The underworld is a machine built on chaos, ego, and blood, but Leo Santoro conquered it with the quiet, unyielding power of structure. He was the ghost they ignored, the air they deemed broken, until Clara Hastings stepped across a ballroom floor and offered him a language he understood. Their partnership defied every brutal tradition of the five families. It wasn't built on the typical Mafia romance tropes of dangerous seduction or blind obedience. It was forged in the quiet geometry of a waltz, the scent of old library blueprints, and the absolute, unwavering trust of two outsiders. Together, they transformed the Santoro Syndicate from a violent empire into an untouchable, mathematically flawless monolith. The men who once refused to look at the Don's autistic son now bowed to his intellect. Clara remained his anchor, his translator, and his equal, the only constant variable in his beautifully ordered world.